Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, July 10th, 2023. Today I want to talk about something that came up in a conversation with a friend of mine a few days ago when he and I were discussing a topic, and I was saying something, whatever it was, and his response was, well, sure, but I don't think most people understand how discourse works. And so I thought maybe today what we would do is simply talk about the idea of what is discourse, or what is a discourse. Now, by thinking about this, I'm not talking about it in some sort of etymological sense or a different disciplinary way to look at it. I'm thinking about it as a specifically post-structuralist, or you might even say critical theoretic framework in contemporary philosophy. So main thinkers in this sort of vein would be people like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Judith Butler, and others. So what is it we talk about when we talk about discourse? It tends to be the case that we think about discourse as just a discussion, right? So we are engaged in a discourse about religion, say, when we are having a conversation about religion. Well, that's not exactly right. For philosophers like those I mentioned, discourse is not simply a conversation about P or Q or X. It is instead a social framework by which P or Q or X can signify in particular ways. In other words, a discourse is what lets something show up as the thing it is in the context of understanding, and in particular of socially shared understanding. This idea of discourse as a framework for meaning making and shared understandings is why we then can think about different types of discourse or discursive spaces. So, for example, when I teach a philosophy of religion class, what I mean by religion might be a very different thing than if I'm just talking about religion with people at my church. The idea is that the different discursive spaces deploy different assumptions, expectations, and ideas that can be taken for granted in relation to the concepts or terms under conversation or under our inquiry. Now, importantly, when we talk about discourse in this way, it's important to differentiate between thinking about discourse itself as an object and operating internal to a discourse. So if I'm simply operating internal to a discourse in my classroom, I'm engaging in a kind of first-order reflective practice, right? I'm just talking about something. But I can only talk about that thing as that thing in the space where it means something for those of us participating in that conversation. Now, that's different, though, than if I take my class and say, hey, instead of simply talking about religion, let's talk about the construction of the category of religion. Now we're looking at the discourse of religion. Now, that distinction is between first order and second order reflection or second order discourse. Why does this stuff matter? Too often, we act like what we say and how we say it and to whom we say it are just obvious, or they're not in need of philosophic attention. They're not in need of care, right? We're not rigorous about these things. But audiences make a difference to what can be said. Not just in what's likely to be successful in getting an audience to agree with you or take on your view, but I'm talking about even the way that I say something and to whom I say it changes what it is that I am claiming in that space of shared engagement. Oftentimes, misunderstanding happens precisely because I might be saying X, but X in this different discursive space doesn't mean X, it means Y, right? So if I say religion in the context of my churches, that means something very different than if I say religion in the context of, let's say, a philosophy of religion seminar. The important thing here is not that these aren't in relation to each other, but that we too often forget the different levels and different spaces by which things mean what they mean for us. So when I was talking to my friend and he said, most people don't understand the working of discourse, what he was saying is we often just act like what we say is obvious for everybody else, and that it just means something statically. But the whole point is not that there's not a world out there, or not that there is not a state of affairs that is independent of my mind and my discourse. It's just that there's no way we could make sense of whatever that state of affairs or that world is, except internal to the context of meaning making and shared understandings that we call the working of discourse. So discourse matters because it is what makes possible what we do as social beings who talk with each other, who interrogate each other, who question each other, and who encourage each other. So instead of seeing discourse as a scary word in critical theory, instead of seeing it just as some sort of radical anti-realist idea that denies the existence of anything outside of textuality and outside of social construction, instead, we should recognize that those debates are themselves different debates internal to different discursive spaces. They're important. But discourse itself, the working of discourse, is this ability that we have to engage each other in ways that make sense. And the point is, sometimes what makes sense in one space doesn't make sense in another. And what we mean may not be what we say, given the different discursive practices and discursive assumptions operative in that community. So maybe this week, think about the different discursive spaces that you navigate among, right? That you move between. Drop some comments. Help me think about different ways that you make sense of the working of discourse in your own life. I'm pretty sure that if we get good at being able to recognize these different spaces, it will facilitate for us an easier time, not only being understood, but also really taking seriously those people with whom we engage in conversation. All right. I hope you have an amazing week. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.